All right, I want to welcome you to the Exponential Groups webinar. My name is Alan White. There I am. And I've been a pastor for 27 years now, actually. My wife and I have been married for 16 years. She's a native Californian. And we have 4 children. Our oldest is 15. Um, I have a son 15, son that's 12. Our daughter is 10. And my little boy, who's no longer a baby, is 4, he says. Don't call him a baby. I have coached over 1,500 churches in the last 13 years, which is a ridiculous number. A lot of those were in groups, but nonetheless. Since 2011, I've helped to start over 14,000 groups, and those groups we added over 125,000 people into groups, which are just ridiculous numbers. And they weren't all like mega churches. I mean, smallest church I ever worked with was 42 people, and largest church I ever worked with was 50,000. So yeah, it's been quite a ride. What I do, I work with churches I coach some churches individually. I have coaching groups. I'll start one in January that'll have 5 churches with it. And I don't like it to be too big of a group. So, we can take best practices that I've learned from working with all these churches, but that also needs to intersect with, where you are and what's going to work in your church, in your culture, in your part of the country and all of that. So I keep the group small, and I only offer this a couple times a year. So if that's something you're interested in, that might be something you would want to contact me about, just so that you can get on the list. I also do online courses. And I'll tell you about a new course toward the end. I've written a book called Exponential Groups with Hendrickson Publishers, came out in February of this year. And also I blog over at alanwhite.org. You can catch me on Twitter at Alan White, and I don't tweet that much, or on Facebook. My page is Alan White Consulting. So let's talk about growth. And what are exponential groups? Well, a lot of it comes out of different types of growth. And the growth typically is determined by what you focus on in your small group ministry. So there's growth by addition, there's growth by multiplication, there's growth by campaign, I call it. We'll get into that in a bit. And then there's what I call exponential growth. Now, of course, there's also, subtraction and division and those sorts of things. But we're going to talk about positive things today. How about that? So let's start with growth by addition. And again, how your groups grow in your church is largely determined by how you view your congregation. So let's say this is your church. This is actually the church I serve here in Greenville, South Carolina, a church of about 6,500 people. And when you grow by addition, it usually comes from the point of view that you see your people as being sheep without a shepherd. Now, Jesus said something like that, so it seems very biblical and very correct. But in groups ministry, it's a little bit different point of view. I'm not arguing with Jesus, just in case you're getting that impression. All right. But growth by addition says this. The focus is connecting members into groups. And so we form groups. We have to find a leader from somewhere. And then we form groups based on maybe their zip code or the area of town that they live in. We sort them out, or maybe we sort them into different types of affinities, but we figure out some way that we think is best of how people should connect into groups. Well, in order to have groups, we have to have leaders, and so often we handpick these leaders. And this is where I was for a long time. If you were leading a group of my church, it's because I knew you, so I personally recruited you, I personally trained you, I personally coached you. And that worked real well, so we got about 30% of our adults in groups, and then we got stuck. And we'll get into that in just a little bit as well. Usually the method in forming these types of groups is to have some kind of a sign-up card or a website. So like I was saying before, people sign up on a card or they go to the website and they fill out their information, and then we place them in some kind of a group. Now, if you've read my blog at all, you know that I don't have good feelings about sign-up cards or websites. And here's why. The church I attend, they have an area of the church that's called the Next Steps area. And so they have a bank of computers that are there. And so if you want to sign up for baptism, you go to the computer and you fill out a form and sign up for baptism. And if you want to join, be part of the next membership class, you go and sign up for the membership class. And if you want to be part of a small group, you look at all the listing on the website, you check one of those groups. And and then wait to hear something back from somebody. So I asked a friend of mine who is the small group pastor. I said, so and he knows me, he knows what I do, so he knows I wasn't being ornery. But just out of curiosity, I said, how many people signed up to be in a group last week? And he said, well, we had 52 people sign up to be in a group. I said, well, that's great. I said, now out of the 52, how many of those were contacted by a leader and invited to a group? And so he had to check for a minute. He looked up the date on his phone. He said, well, it looks like 27 of them um, were actually contacted by a leader. So if you're doing your math, 52 signed up, 27 were contacted. So we've already cut the number in half. And then the next question we asked was, well, how many of those people actually made it to a group? And the response was, I don't know. And the reality is, when I did things this way, my response would have been, I don't know. I could have gotten a roster. I could have done, but to follow up with each person to make sure the leader made the call, which half of them in my church didn't, there's a lot of errors in this. And the result was that you put forth a lot of effort because administratively, this is a challenge. I mean, whether you're talking about dozens of people or hundreds of people or thousands of people, it's a lot of effort administratively. And I don't know about you, I served one church for 15 years. I never had an assistant. And then the church of 6,500 that I served here in Greenville, I had an assistant, but my assistant was my only full-time staff member. So the reason that growth by addition struggles is that you can never recruit enough leaders by yourself. You can never recruit enough leaders by yourself. And then the other issue is very often when you try to place people in groups, either by affinity or by geography or by some other means, the members don't really stick. They may go to the group, but maybe, there's nobody there that they know, and maybe the people aren't warm. Maybe they're just different personalities. They like different things at a different stage of life. Who knows? But they just don't stick for whatever reason. And this has been my experience with growth by addition. So let's go to growth by multiplication, because multiplication sounds better than addition, doesn't it? And so growing by multiplication, we look at our congregation, we ask ourselves, how can we multiply leaders? How can we get more leaders? And so the focus here is developing group leaders, which is a great focus. In fact, I would say, and if you've read my book at all, that I believe the primary purpose of small groups is leadership development. Now, there are a lot of other great purposes for groups like connection and assimilation, discipleship and growth, outreach, evangelism, serving. I mean, the list goes on and on, but I believe the primary purpose is leadership development. So I bought into this idea early on, but I also bought into this idea of growth by multiplication. So I have a great friend, his name's Carl George. And in the small group world, we refer to Carl as Yoda. And about 25 years ago, he went over to Korea and went in and experienced Cho's Church and saw what they were doing with groups. And then he came back to the US in the early 90s and wrote a book called Prepare Your Church for the Future, which has become the standard. It's what we call the meta-church model. And if you look at the small group system at Willow Creek, it really was in a lot of ways a textbook meta-church model in the early days when they had 17,000 in groups. Things have kind of changed since then. But also kind of the basis of what Saddleback does, what North Point does. I mean, again, their own variations on it, but this was kind of the foundation. And the strategy of this model was that we would multiply leaders because every group would develop an apprentice. Now, some of you may be hearing this and you're rolling your eyes. We're only halfway through. Just bear with me. We'll get to better stuff. And the methodology was that you would raise up this apprentice, and then at some point the group would split. You would form two groups. Well, this was the plan that I started out with about, gosh, when did we start? 20 years ago. Boy, that makes me sound really old. And so our church was growing at a steady pace. We weren't growing dramatically, but we were growing by about 100 a year and did that for 15 years in a row. So that was actually a really good pace. And so I thought, well, we need to catch up with the people that we have in our church, and then we need to anticipate the future growth, seeing how the pattern is. And so I decided, I created this 5-year strategy that I thought, well, what we'll do is we'll recruit 10 leaders, stellar people that I knew and believed in, because I still stuck with that criteria. A lot of it was out of my own need for control, but that's a whole other webinar. But anyway, recruited about 10, and I thought, well, here's what's going to happen. The next year, they're going to all, identify and train an apprentice. That apprentice is going to start a new group, and then the next year, all of our groups are going to double, and then we're going to add some more. And we're going to keep doing that, and then in 5 years, we will have caught up with the current growth of our church, and then the projected growth, and everybody will be in a group. And so here's the deal. 7 years into our 5-year plan, I realized this wasn't working the way that I thought it would. And so the result was that group members didn't want to leave their groups. They wanted to stay together. We invited them into a group and said it was like their family, and they didn't want to divorce their family. And so we didn't see a lot of multiplication. I had one group where one guy developed an apprentice and started a group, and that's the only one we had. And the reason is, first of all, our leaders couldn't identify an apprentice. But this was the means of growing our group. And so I put a lot of pressure on this and said, listen, you've got to find somebody in your group that you can apprentice, because they're going to develop a group next year, and that's how this is going to grow. And it got to the point that my leaders would walk by me on Sunday morning, and they'd look me in the eye and they'd say, I'm working on my apprentice. And I thought, whatever happened to hello? And then the other thing was, and I said this before, was that the group members wanted to stay together. So even if they did, develop an apprentice, they didn't want to leave their group. So what do? Well, we were stuck, and I mean stuck. And we couldn't get any further. And as hard as we tried and as much pressure as we applied to this thing, it just did not happen. If you're doing this and you've got everybody in groups, congratulations. I want to hear your webinar on how you did it, because I couldn't make it work. Now, at one point, I did go back and talk to my friend and mentor, and I said, this apprentice thing doesn't work. And he said, well, the apprentice model works well in educated congregations. And I muttered under my breath, the apprentice model works well in Korea. And nothing against Korea, but they can have their model. Okay, so the next one I called growth by campaign. And this was the idea that we would go back, we'd look at our congregation again, and we would ask ourselves, can we connect 100% or more into small groups? And so the focus was connecting anybody and everybody. So our strategy, and this is not a bad strategy, was we asked people to self-identify as leaders. And so we would use language like, would you host a group instead of lead a group? Now, I know this is 15 years old, and this goes back to 40 Days of Purpose in 2002, but this was an innovative idea. And to some, this still is an innovative idea, that we asked people, because most people, we asked them, would you like to lead a small group? They would say, I'm not a leader. So when we said, well, would you host a group, and the teaching's on a video and it's fairly easy to do, and we're going to give you some support, we're going to give you some training and coaching from the church, well, that was a little more acceptable to people. Or some, we would even say, would you get together with your friends and do the study? So now not only we didn't say leader, we didn't say group. They're just getting together with their friends and doing the study. So this idea of people self-identifying, giving this kind of a test drive, if you will, and then we could determine whether or not they enjoyed it or they were any good at it, and then maybe they would continue. Our methodology was some sort of video-based curriculum. And so we wanted this to be easy to use. Now, here's the great thing about video curriculum. For the person who's leading the group, there's not a ton of prep time, and they don't have to be regarded as the Bible expert in the group, because the expert's on the video. But here's the thing from our side of this. We start all of these groups. Maybe we don't know some people very well, or maybe we don't know them at all. And again, I'm a recovering control freak, and at the beginning, I had to know everybody well before they led a group. And it was a big day when somebody started talking about a person that was leading a group, and had never heard of them before. I couldn't have picked them up out of a lineup. So when you have people that maybe you don't know as well, and then you wonder, I wonder what they're teaching in those groups. Oh yeah, they're teaching the video curriculum that I gave them. I know what they're teaching because our pastor's on that video, or we purchased that video and we know it's good, solid teaching. So we don't have to worry about what's being taught because we chose the teaching and gave it to them. And then the other thing that came out of this was the idea of a short-term group. Lyman Coleman said years ago that you want to do groups initially for 6 weeks, because 6 weeks is short enough for a man to commit to, and it's long enough for a man to sense community. And the operative word there is man, because with women's groups they need like 6 minutes and they're good. They're sisters for life. Men need a little more time for that. So the short-term group, kind of the trial run, asking people to lead, the video curriculum, all of that worked very, very well. And so here's a little bit of my story. Back in 2004, when we were stuck, after 7 years of pounding my head against the wall, our pastor had decided to do a sermon series along with Passion of the Christ. And so he had already planned out what his sermons would be. He'd already purchased some advertising. And so I walked into his office one day and said, "Hey, Pastor Dave, what would you think about launching groups based on the Passion of Christ?" And he said, "Well, I think that's a great idea." Now, here's the thing. In the first 25 of my 27 years in ministry, I've been the minister of Christian education, the associate pastor at my first church. I was both of those titles. Then I was the executive director, and then I was the discipleship pastor, and then I was the vice president. And so only in the last 2 years do I become president of my own organization. But I'm also the secretary. I'm also the janitor. So don't be terribly impressed. But here's the thing. Having been in that number 2 role for a long time, is that if you can piggyback off of where your senior pastor is going, you have better chances of your senior pastor being involved and consenting with what you want to do. I didn't tell my pastor to do a series on the Passion of the Christ. He was already doing a series on the Passion of the Christ. I just asked if small groups could be a part of that, and he was very enthusiastic about that because he was already enthusiastic about the series that was coming up. See, I'm no dummy. So I said, here's the deal. I said, I found a study that we can use, but we need to create a video, and you need to be on the video. I'm saying this to my pastor, and he agreed. But here's the thing. We decided to do this 3 weeks before the series started. So we did it ourselves. I used my home video camera. We went in the auditorium because that was the best lighting. We shot these 1 week ahead of when the groups needed them, and we output them to VHS tape. This is back in 2004. It seems like the Stone Age now. But we output them to VHS tape. So every week in my office, I had this tape exchange going, and the leaders would bring in last week's tape. I would give them this week's tape. Then I would take last week's tape to the duplicator, and it would become next week's tape. And it worked. And we were 1 week ahead. We did this for 6 weeks in a row. Thank the Lord that nobody got sick, because we would have been sunk. But here's the key. My pastor stood up on a Sunday morning and he said, if you would be interested in opening up your home and starting one of these groups based on this curriculum that we've created, we'll help you get that group started. And we doubled our groups in 1 day. 1 day. I had been stuck at 30% after 7 years. We doubled our groups in a day, which created a lot of other problems we'll get into later. So 7 years, I'm working hard. We get to 30%, and in 1 day, we get to 60%. And so Growth Bag campaign, the result was we had a lot of excitement for 6 weeks. We really did. And then, the bottom falls out. Anybody can do a 6-week campaign and have a lot of fanfare and have a lot of people involved and have groups coming out of your ears. But you have to have a plan for what's next, or else it just falls off the cliff. But also in this idea of growth by campaign, I see the potential for what I call exponential groups. Now, the reason we struggled was, first of all, we had no plan after 6 weeks. I mentioned that. And then the growth, because it was so dramatic, it completely overwhelmed our coaching structure. I mean, we doubled our groups. I wasn't adequately coaching the 30% that we had in groups. So I thought, what am I going to do? And then it dawned on me, we doubled. So it meant that half of them were new and half of them had some experience, despite me, in successfully leading a group. So I just matched them up. We just created the buddy system. And so I had an experienced leader with a new leader, and they walked alongside with them. And that was coaching good enough for the moment. But here's the deal. Within 6 months, we were at a place where we actually had 125% of our adult attendance in groups. Now, that's not funny pastor math. We had groups that met in break rooms at work, and sometimes the leader of that group was the only person who attended our church. We had groups that met in coffee shops together. I had one group that met on a commuter train, and every Tuesday morning, They would travel from Stockton, California to San Jose, and they would take up a whole section of the train and they would do a Bible study. Now, obviously, this is not a picture of that group because this woman standing up in the front looks kind of grumpy. But anyway, maybe she's being convicted of something. I don't know. All right, so let's get to exponential growth. With exponential growth, again, you go back and you look at your congregation, but this is how you see them. You ask yourself, is this an audience or is this an army? Because if this is an audience, we have to make them comfortable. If this is an audience, we have to have a performance. We have to entertain them, or else they might not come back. If you want them in a group, we have to provide a group for them. We have to recruit the leader for them. We have to cater to them. That's what you do with an audience. But if this congregation is an army, that is a whole different story. Because if this is an army, what I need to do is equip them and empower them and send them out to invite their friends, their neighbors, their co-workers, other people that they know in the community into a Bible study. And imagine the growth of that. Imagine what would happen, how many groups you could possibly have. Imagine how many people could potentially join your church if the vast majority were out there leading groups. And maybe I'm thinking too far out there, but I'm going to tell you some stories in a minute that go right along those lines. So the focus is that every member can gather a group. Every person who is a regular part of your church can gather a group. Now, bear in mind whatever the limits are by your elders, by your leadership, by your pastor, you keep that in mind. But every member could lead a group. The strategy is you give permission and you give opportunity. You give permission and opportunity. And it's amazing. I didn't say, hey, we need a group for people that commute on the train. Can anybody lead a group like that? We need a group that meets at a coffee shop. Can anybody lead a group like that? We need a group that meets, in the break room over here at BMW. Can anybody lead a group like that? No, we didn't ask that at all. We said, we're going to give you an opportunity to get together with people you know and do a Bible study. They came up with where those groups were, what those groups were, and where those groups met. And we didn't tell them where to go. They just did it. The methodology is, again, to offer an easy-to-use curriculum. Again, I would recommend doing video. Now, you don't have to go out and spend $1 million shooting video curriculum. I mean, I've got churches that are they're shooting decent video and they're using a phone and they're posting it up on YouTube. They catch the pastor between the services or shooting the video. They have a downloadable discussion guide. They put the link to the video in the top of that, and then they print out the questions for their group, and that's their curriculum. So you don't have to spend a ton of money or a ton of time doing this. You can make it pretty simple. And even if the quality is not like up where some of the things you purchase would be, that's okay. Because it's yours and it's your pastor on the video, your pastors on the video. And that's awesome. So give them an easy to use curriculum, give them basic training, and give them coaching support, and they're good to go. The result is that people are connected both inside the church and outside the church. Now, I wish I could say I was smart enough to think of this, but we actually had people that were being invited to their friends group. They had never darkened the door of our church. They were getting to know our pastor through the video teaching. And when they were invited to church, they felt like they already knew him because they were being introduced to him in the comfort of their friend's living room. And so don't call this outreach and evangelism because people are intimidated by that. But that's what it really became, was outreach and evangelism, because somebody invited somebody over that had kids and said, hey, we're going to do this parenting study, or we're going to do this marriage study, or something that was a relevant topic to them. The reason, first of all, is to leverage existing relationships. A lot of times people don't have time for a small group because they know if they join a small group at the church, they're going to have to give up time with their friends. So what if their friends were the small group? And then the other reason that this worked was we gave them permission to start a group on their own terms. And there are many, many stories of people that never thought or never wanted to be part of a group, that once we opened this up a little bit, and they still had coaching, they still had training. We didn't just turn this loose and let people do, everything that they wanted. But there were some guardrails on this. But once we gave them permission to do something that would work for them, we received exponential results. So let's talk about 4 keys to an exponential launch. The first key is this: is your senior pastor all in? Is your senior pastor all in? Now, some would say, I would love that, but my pastor doesn't talk about groups. My pastor is not in a group. My pastor doesn't preach about community. My pastor sees groups as one of many options. And there are a lot of reasons that pastors think that. Sometimes pastors think if I start small groups for everybody else, then I'm going to have to be in a small group, and I don't want to be in a small group. Therefore, I'm not going to ask everybody else to be in the small group because I don't want to be a hypocrite. So here's the quick one on that. Your pastor has friends, whether they're other pastors or members of the church or whoever. So find a group that the pastor is already in and call that his small group. They pray together, they share together about life, about ministry, they share from the word, and maybe it's a little more casual, a little more relaxed. If the pastor and his wife are doing something together, then you really want to make sure that the pastor's wife is comfortable with the group that they're leading. Or the pastor could be a member of a group, and that's okay. But there are a lot of options to how to take the pressure off with the pastor, because you and I both know as church staff, the way that we relate to our church is very different from the average member of our church. And it's been interesting now, having been a member of a church for 6 years and not being on staff. I see things a lot differently than when I was a staff member. Of course, there is still kind of that critical eye of a consultant that sees what's wrong and how it can be fixed, but that's a whole other story. All right, so how do you get your pastor involved? First of all, put your pastor's teaching on the curriculum. Put your pastor's teaching on the curriculum. So why would you do that? Well, first of all, your congregation is going to be more interested if it's your pastor. Because think about this. If the members of your church are not connected to each other, the reason that they attend your church other than Jesus Christ is because of your senior pastor. They like his personality, they enjoy his teaching, they laugh at his jokes. They're there because they like your senior pastor. And let me caution you here. Don't mention this to your worship pastor because it'll break his heart. But when you say, we're going to give you this curriculum based on our pastor's teaching, well, you're giving your people more of what they already want. But here's the other side of this. When your pastor invests in putting teaching on video and creating teaching that's going to go along with the sermon series or not, the pastor is going to want to make sure that there are groups and there are leaders to use this curriculum because they don't want it to be a failure. In fact, there was a church we were working with, I'll talk about it a little more in a minute, but we were working with them in Tampa, Florida about 6 years ago. And we spent a whole day, we shot the video and different segments that we were going to need to use in the curriculum. And the next morning, the pastor pulled us into his office and said, now, we've shot this video and we're creating this curriculum. Now, how are we going to recruit leaders and how are we going to get people connected into groups? His discipleship pastor pulled me aside later in the day and he said, I've been asking my pastor to get more involved with small groups in 2 years. He said, and you just did it. I mean, it was almost like an accusation. And I just smiled at him and said, well, I'm Alan White. No, I did not say that. The reality was because the pastor had spent a day and made this investment in filming video for curriculum, then he wanted to make sure that it was going to win and it was going to move forward. Now, in this picture is Chip Ingram, and he pastors Venture Church out in Los Gatos, California, out in Silicon Valley. And Venture Church has about 2,200 adults. And when I started working with them back in 2015, they had about 120 small groups, which is a respectable number of groups in a church of 2,200. And then he wanted to do a big launch, so we did this with his Holy Ambition book, and so I was there directing the video. I wrote the study guide for it, and then he made the announcement. He made the appeal, and people would stay after the service and get their briefing and get their coach and all the things that they needed to succeed. And in that study in fall of 2015, they started 400 groups. They went from 120 to 400, and then I was talking to Chip a while back, and last year, they did another series with his video and his teaching, and they launched 500 groups. Again, in a church of 2,200 people. They had 400 groups, and then they had 500 groups. So these sorts of things are very possible. Also, you want to find a small group solution for the things that your pastor is concerned about. Because when you look at research, you look at books like Transformational Groups by Ed Stetzer and Eric Geiger, or you look at Sharing the Journey, which is an older book, probably 20 years old, by Robert Wuthnow, who's a professor at Princeton University. It's interesting, they come up with basically the same results. But what they find is people that are in groups attend church more often, they give more, they serve more, all of these great things. They're growing more spiritually than people that aren't in groups. And so whatever your pastor is concerned about, your pastor is concerned about how do we evangelize, then we show the pastor, here are some ways that groups can be evangelistic by having a relevant topic, inviting friends to come into the group, and then they're brought to church, and they're people that maybe were far from God, people that never, didn't attend church or haven't attended church in a very long time, and you're bringing them in. And if your pastor is big on evangelism and maybe not so big on discipleship, that's actually a pretty good conversation to have. So studies show that people in groups, I said this a minute ago, give more and serve more than people that are not in groups. And I could give you anecdotes, but I won't. The reality is this is all based on research. The second key is this: is your topic relevant? Is your topic relevant? So I had a church a couple of years ago, and they said, well, we start every year with a 21-day fast, and so we want to do a curriculum on fasting. And I thought, wow, that's, a fairly mature topic. It's going to be a little challenging to start groups with, a topic of fasting. I thought, well, the refreshments are going to be pretty easy, but it was a challenge. Or anything to do with money, giving, budgeting, tithing, anything to do with money. Money is so personal. And obviously there's a spiritual thing there because you can't serve God and money, right? Probably not the best topic to start groups with, especially if people are outside of the church, because thanks to all of the televangelists, they've given the world the impression that the church only wants your money. Now, the reality is the mall only wants your money, but somehow that's different than the church wanting your money. So there you go. Now, I had one church that they wanted to do a curriculum to train their people on how to do evangelism. And I thought, again, we have a pretty mature topic, and this is going to be a hard one for people because, there's an intimidation factor there. And so we actually talked about this, and I said, what if you did, instead of doing a curriculum on evangelism, what if we created a curriculum that was evangelistic? And so we thought about the common needs in this particular community and what the Bible had to say about them. And we made this evangelistic series where the pastor presented the message of the gospel on video. There were instructions in the study guide. The leaders were trained of what to do if somebody wants to receive Christ. And so we made an evangelistic study, but it wasn't evangelism training as they originally wanted to do. All right. Now, some studies that have worked great. Obviously, The Purpose-Driven Life, second best-selling nonfiction book, second only to the Bible in history. 1 Month to Live by Carrie Shook. This came out about 10 years ago. We sent postcards to our community here in Greenville, and the Sunday that we started this series, our attendance jumped by 1,000. I had people coming up to the table. That was their first time they ever attended the church, and they wanted to know if they could do the Bible study. And I said, absolutely. That may scare some of you. Hope Rising was a series we did with Gene Apple a few years ago. He gave us out to every person who attended Easter Sunday in 2012. And they started 460 groups based on Hope Rising. Monsters Under the Bed, this was a church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and just addressing people's common fears. Hand-Me-Downs is a church in Middle Georgia. I was about leaving a legacy. Family Matters is a church in the Indianapolis area. And what we did with this one was we took previous sermons that the pastor had preached on marriage and family, and then I actually did the editing on this. So we edited it down to a 10-minute script and then sent it back to the pastor to make sure it sounded like him and not like me. And then we put it in a teleprompter, and then he presented to a little group that was gathered in a living room and came up with this curriculum. This was a church at the time. They were 4,000 people. I think they're 10,000 people now. But they were a church of 4,000 people. And this has just been a couple years ago. They already had 3,000 people in groups. And with this curriculum, the first time the pastor had ever put his teaching on the video, and they made an invitation for people to get together with their friends and do the study, they actually launched 200 more groups on top of what they already had for this series. So again, a relevant topic, the pastor's teaching, these are good things. The next thing you want to ask is, how's your coaching structure? And some of us are going to get nervous now. We say, oh, I don't have a coaching structure. My coaching structure is terrible. Well, that's okay. But here's something I want you to know. When you decide to launch groups, and whether you're doing it traditionally by recruiting leaders, whether you're doing host homes, whether you're saying get together with your friends and do the study, it is mission critical. From the time that a person says, yes, I want to do a group, until the study starts, it is mission critical to have someone checking in on them every week, because more people will drop out in that window than if they do the 6 weeks, and not nearly as many are going to drop out after they've done the 6 weeks. They're going to go on to another study if you offer one. But in that window of they come to a briefing, they come to a training, and the start of the groups, that's when most of them drop off. And this can't be an email distribution list. This has to be a phone call. And so you need experienced leaders, you need coaches, people that are going to walk alongside them from when they say yes to the end of the study. They're going to call them once a week and check in on them, encourage them, pray for them, answer their questions, all of those things. Because these are the sort of things that happen. Let's say, this guy in the blue shirt on the right side of the screen invites some people over for a barbecue, and he's going to invite them to be part of his group. He says, hey, I'm doing this group on Tuesday night for the series that the church is doing. And somebody says, oh, we're so sorry, we're already in a group. And then somebody else says, oh, Tuesday's not going to work for us. We've got something else going on. And then the other guy says, hey, buddy, I'm sorry to tell you, I'm really not your friend. Now, this guy is going to feel very, very discouraged. And if nobody calls him, if nobody checks in on him, he's just going to wander off, and he's going to think this was a really bad idea, and God's not going to use me like this, and I might as well forget it. Now, if a coach calls him and said, how'd it go? We said, well, okay, I invited these people over. We had burgers, we had root beers. That's the root beers in their hands. And they all said no. And then the coach says, you know what? Not everybody I've invited has accepted. I've had a lot of people turn me down, but let's pray about who God wants to have in your group. And then encourage this guy so he'll continue on and he'll form a group. And it's not just about, oh, we want to pick up our numbers, we want to show great numbers, we want to brag about how many groups we got. It's not about that. What it's about is, this guy may never try it again. This guy may have the stuff to be a great leader, but if somebody is not there to encourage him and to speak into his life, he may give up and never try to lead anything again. And it's important, it's critical that at that time that somebody reaches out to him and helps him. So this is the place you're going to handpick anybody. This is the place where you tap your current leaders on the shoulder and say, hey, would you help me out? We're going to get inundated with new leaders this fall, because pastor's going to invite from the platform. We're doing this curriculum that, he's on the video. And honestly, I know this is the second week in August. It's not too late to do this. I mean, even if you're shooting them one at a time and you don't have to put them out on VHS tape because nobody has a VHS player anymore, you can put them up on YouTube. And you can be in great shape doing that. But you tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, we're going to have a great influx of new leaders, and I need your help. And people will respond to that. The fourth thing is, what's the next step? Because the problem with a 6-week campaign or a 40-day campaign is you get to day 41, and you've had great success during the campaign, and then you get to the end of it, and it falls off the cliff. And a lot of us that have done campaigns have experienced exactly that. So what you have to do is offer a next step. So in the middle of the current series, you want to offer them another series to study. Don't give them a choice, not for new groups. For established groups, they can go back to their usual pattern, however you do that. But for new groups, you want to give them one choice, and maybe it's about community or being a small group or whatever. And in the middle of it, you say, the first study, you say, hey, if you guys are like it, enjoy meeting together, enjoy being a group, hey, we're going to offer this other study, and it's going to start right after this one ends, depending on when you start, or it's going to start up in January, and we'd love to have you be a part of that. And then from the middle of the series, when you introduce the idea of the next step, until the end of the study, you want to help the group make a decision about whether or not they're going to continue. Or maybe the leader can't continue, but another member of the group would step up and lead the group. But once they get finished with the series and they disband, it's harder to get them back together and to make a decision. And usually the group at that point is just going to falter and it's not going to continue at all. So you want to offer that in the middle of the first study and then get a decision by the end of that first study. Now, let me tell you a couple of churches that I've worked with in the last few years. This Bay Hope Church in Lutz, Florida. This is a church I was talking about earlier. It's a Methodist church. It used to be called Van Dyke Church. They just changed their name. So in the book, they're Van Dyke Church, but now they're Bay Hope. This is a church of 1,800 adults. They were stuck at about 30% of their adults in groups. They had about 400 adults in groups. We coached them. They produced their own curriculum. Their team produced the curriculum. Added some different strategies of how to form groups, how to recruit leaders. And in the first launch in the fall of 2011, they went from 400 adults in groups to 600 adults in groups. And then we did it again in the new year of 2012, and they had 1,000 people in groups. So they went from 1,000, I'm sorry, to 1,600 in groups in the new year. And then after Easter, they actually got to a place where they went over 2,000 people in groups in a church of 1,800. But here's the cool news. The pastor here is Matthew Hartsville. He's been there for about 25 years. And I was talking to him last fall. I actually had him on a webinar and interviewed him. And he said that, after this big push for a year, I mean, their staff was exhausted. He was exhausted. They're producing all of this curriculum. So they kind of took their foot off the gas, and groups kind of went down a little bit, not terrible, but a little bit. But then they started giving the groups what they needed when they needed it. And the end result was the church had grown from 1,800 to 2,300 adults. And they currently maintain 80 to 90% of their adults in ongoing small groups. And so this is cool for me because a church that I started working with 6 years ago, and they did a year that was fairly intensive in recruiting and getting more than people in groups than they had on the weekend. And to see them 6 years later and still maintaining 80 to 90% is pretty awesome. This is Father Charlie Holt. He pastors St. Peter's Episcopal in Orlando. When I first met him about 12 years ago, they had 260 adults on a Sunday morning. They started 75 groups for 40 Days of Purpose. So a church of 260 adults had 750 people in groups. Now, how did they do that? They went out and invited their friends, their neighbors, their coworkers, other people they knew in the community to do a study with them. And they had a great result. And so, I mean, to triple the number of your weekend attendance in groups, that's pretty amazing. This is Pastor Troy Jones at New Life Church in Renton, Washington. This is Assemblies of God Church. It's a church of about 2,500 adults. And when I started working with them in January of 2015, they had 100 groups at the beginning, produced curriculum. He paid to have our team create the first curriculum, and then his team created the second one once they saw what to do. We added, again, some new strategies to how we recruited leaders and formed groups. After doing these two series, they had gone from 100 groups in their church, 100 groups, not 100 people in groups, 100 groups to 500 groups in a church of 2,500. So they had double the people in groups that they had attending the weekend service. And Pastor Troy caught this vision of people inviting their friends and neighbors who had never been to New Life to their homes, meeting Pastor Troy on the video, and then being invited to the church, and how this small group strategy was starting to grow their church. Now, I don't know if you know your geography, but Washington State is not anywhere near the Bible Belt. In fact, it's probably 2,500, 3,000 miles away from the Bible Belt. But he saw this working so well, he actually made it a goal to have 1,000 small groups in his church of 2,500, which is pretty remarkable. Now, here are a couple of things I'm going to talk to you about that I could possibly help you, and this is going to be short. The first thing is I'm going to start a 12-month coaching group in January. And what I do in the 12-month group is I do 6 months of training. We would meet twice a month as a group of 5 churches on a call. And then we would do 6 months of follow-up. So you have 6 months of training, and then you're actually putting into practice, and then I follow up along, with one-on-one calls. The group's going to start in January of 2018. The truth is, if you sign up now, I'll start coaching you now. And then when we get to January, you can have like a year and a half for the price of a year. So if you're interested in that, just email info@alanwhite.org to get more information on the coaching group. The other thing that I have that you could actually start today if you wanted to is I have an online course that's called Leading an Exponential Group Launch that will walk you through every step that you need to take to form healthy groups that are going to last, recruit the right leaders, develop your coaching structure, provide the training that they need, all of those pieces, and then what's going to help them to continue on into the future. And so if you're interested in this, you can actually go to exponentialgroupscourse.com and then /sales, and it'll give you all of the information about that coaching course. It starts at about $249, and then there's some options that you can add if you choose to do that. All right, so I'm finished with the presentation here. So I'm going to actually stop the recording.